question is why this issue does not belong to the national sovereignty. So to have migration, it's a decision of Italy, France, Germany, Hungary, Poland. It cannot be a common decision. Why you would like to force us?
The problem is a German problem. Nobody would like to stay in Hungary.
Hungary's bold new tactic of sending buses filled with migrants directly to Brussels is causing a stir across Europe. This unprecedented move, designed as a protest against EU migration policies, is raising eyebrows from border nations to the heart of the European Union.
Whose decision is that? It belongs to the people and the elected leaders of the nations, not to the empiristic center of any integration reforms.
From defying asylum rules to openly challenging Brussels' leadership, Hungary's latest escalation is sparking intense debate and tension throughout the continent. Join us as we unpack the details of this dramatic strategy and explore the broader impact on migration, EU unity, and Hungary's place in the European political landscape. Let's dive in. The buses to Brussels. To get into the details, Hungary has organized buses to transport migrants who are seeking asylum from its borders directly to Brussels, where the European Union headquarters are located. The Hungarian government has made it clear that this isn't just a transportation service for these individuals. It's a loud political statement aimed squarely at the EU and its policies on migration. The use of yellow buses in Hungary is quite arresting and a little puzzling. It feels nearly like these buses surpass just being transportation. They seem to represent Hungary's defiance. No matter if the color was chosen with intent, it's pretty hard not to think of school buses when you catch sight of them. A visual like this can lead one to believe that Hungary is trying to show the EU how to address migration problems. For years, the government of Hungary has been quite outspoken in challenging the EU's migration policies. Prime Minister Orbán and his government have repeatedly insisted that the EU's migration policy is unjust, especially for Hungary, as one of the first countries to defend the EU's external borders. By taking asylum seekers and transporting them directly to Brussels, Hungary seems to be sending a bold message. If the EU holds that we ought to manage these migrants, then maybe Brussels should deal with them straight away. Hungary's plan remains unexecuted, but it has already produced an obvious separation between Hungary and other nations in Europe. Orbán's government has repeatedly clashed with Brussels over the EU's management of migration, and this latest action looks like a clear reaction to the relentless pressure from the EU. After the European Court of Justice fined Hungary a heavy €200 million in 2020 for violating EU asylum rules, Hungary proposed using buses to send migrants from its Serbian border to Brussels. Orbán claims that the penalty forms part of the broader EU effort to penalize Hungary for its tough position on migration. The plan has faced strong criticism, especially from leaders like Mayor Kloos of the Belgian Socialist Party, who warned that Belgium will not tolerate these actions. In a pointed statement, Kloos remarked that Orbán's government is small, implying that Hungary will eventually cave under Europe's collective pressure. He added that Belgium would not allow itself to be held hostage by a far-right administration like Orbán's. The deeper issue at play here comes from the EU's common asylum policy, particularly the Dublin regulation. This rule requires asylum seekers to have their claims processed in the first EU country they enter, which has placed an outsized burden on border nations like Hungary. Orbán has repeatedly criticized this system as unjust, saying it forces certain countries to handle the majority of asylum seekers, while other nations, farther from the EU's external borders, don't feel the same strain. This tension over migration has only deepened the rift between Hungary and Brussels, leading to ongoing disputes over how to manage Europe's migration challenges in a fair way. Let's break down the numbers to understand Hungary's stance better. Escalating tensions. Back in 2015, during the height of the migration crisis, Hungary became a major stop for migrants trying to reach richer countries in Northern Europe, like Germany and Sweden. That year alone, More than 391,000 migrants passed through Hungary, according to the UN's International Organization for Migration. This sudden wave of people overwhelmed Hungary's resources, creating chaos for the government as the country struggled to cope. The stress from that time still influences Hungary's current policies. Today, things look very different. In 2022, Hungary received fewer than 500 asylum applications. This huge drop is mostly due to Hungary's strict border control, including a fence along its southern border with Serbia and Croatia. These tough measures have cut down the number of migrants entering the country, but they haven't solved the bigger issue of how to handle asylum seekers once they're in the EU. This is where the yellow buses come in. These buses aren't just randomly transporting migrants. The operation is carefully planned, although details are kept somewhat secret. Migrants who want to seek asylum in the EU are offered transportation directly to Brussels, where they can start the application process. The Hungarian government views this plan as a way to help both the migrants and the EU. Their logic is, if Brussels wants a more balanced system for distributing asylum seekers across the EU, why not send them directly to the EU's political heart in Brussels? The buses typically depart from Hungary's southern border regions, which is where many migrants first enter the country. While exact figures on how many migrants have actually been transported to Brussels via these buses are hard to come by, the Hungarian government has made it clear that this is an ongoing effort. The buses can carry around 50 people at a time, and with multiple trips likely occurring, it's possible that hundreds of migrants have already been brought to Brussels over a short span of time. Even with these actions, there are worries about the bigger impact of Hungary's policy. Hungary argues that sending buses to Brussels is a practical way to deal with what it sees as an unfair burden on border countries under the EU's migration rules. But this move has stirred controversy. Other EU countries, especially those not facing the same migration pressures, see it as more of a provocation than a solution. Brussels is not happy with Hungary's approach, and it has only made tensions between Hungary and the EU worse. While Hungary's strict border controls have significantly reduced the number of migrants entering the country, it hasn't solved the ongoing issue of how to fairly handle migration across Europe. Hungary's yellow bus plan might be a short-term fix, or even a way to make a bold statement, but the bigger question remains: how will the EU deal with migration in the long term? Brussels is not pleased with Hungary's bus initiative. It has increased the tension between the EU Commission and Hungary's government. For years, the EU has been trying to reform its asylum system to better protect migrants' rights, while also spreading the responsibility for processing claims more evenly across all member countries. Hungary, however, has been one of the strongest critics of these reforms, often disagreeing with Brussels over issues like migration and national sovereignty. The buses are seen as a direct challenge, a way for Hungary to show its frustration with how the EU handles migration and to force Brussels to face the results of its policies. The European Commission hasn't officially commented on the yellow buses, but insiders suggest that there's a growing frustration with Hungary's tactics. Some have called for sanctions or penalties against Hungary, arguing that Orbán is undermining EU solidarity by unilaterally sending migrants to Brussels. However, Hungary's government has defended its actions, pointing out that it's simply following the EU's own rules and giving asylum seekers the chance to apply for protection in the heart of the European Union. Orbán's political strategy. Having yellow buses go to Brussels is completely in sync with Viktor Orbán's larger political ambitions. Since seizing power, Orbán has been regularly seen as a strong proponent of Hungary's autonomy, regularly challenging what he considers to be substantial interference from Brussels. An essential component of his leadership is his tough stance on migration, which he frequently deploys to garner support and complete victories at the polls. His message is clear: Hungary has to impose border control without any external meddling.
And to cross the border illegally, it's an illegal action. So we can't accept that somebody illegally crossing the borderline. It's a crime.
By orchestrating these buses to reach migrants directly in Brussels, Orbán is addressing migration issues as well as communicating directly to his backers at home. A lot of Hungarians dare say they feel like he does about migration, believing that the EU fails to understand the challenges that border countries like Hungary deal with. For Orbán and his allies, it's not only about straightforward data, it's about protecting the culture, safety, and lifestyle of Hungary from what they believe to be harmful foreign influences that could endanger the nation. In this regard, the yellow buses are transcendent being a transport method. Instead, they represent Orbán's political messages. In transporting these buses, Orbán is increasing his standing as a hardened, resilient leader willing to confront Brussels, regardless of the possibility of open defiance against the EU. His backers view him as the one who will defend Hungary's interests at all expenses, regardless of the debates. This initiative increases the volume of the account provided by Orbán about a Hungary that is unyielding against external impacts, as well as his assessment of misguided European Union measures from Brussels. Still, during this political theater, the human component is often forgotten. The people getting on these buses aren't political actors. They are men and women escaping war, persecution, or compelling economic difficulties in their homelands. For many of them, the buses offer a glimpse of hope, a chance to reach Brussels and apply for asylum in a system that, at least in theory, is designed to protect their rights and offer them a fair chance at a better life. These people living in between nations' politics are still in search of security, which they cannot get in their countries. But the life they get once they arrive in Brussels is far from what they have been dreaming of. The EU's asylum system is slow-moving and heavily saturated with bureaucratic procedures. Most asylum seekers spend many years with no way of knowing when their claims will be processed, let alone to be granted protection. Many a time, the process can be lengthy with so many things standing in the way, and finally, many cases end up being declined. This puts migrants in a precarious legal situation with no clear direction on what to do all this time, and there is no way they can appeal. As we have seen with the action on yellow buses, as much as they are an attempt to tell something to the EU, it also shows what Europe faces with migration. For Orbán's government, the buses are an opportunity to challenge Brussels to seriously address the question of migration. Yet the question of how to fairly distribute the burden of the asylum seekers between EU countries remains unanswered. It remains layered unequally across member countries like Hungary, and these differences continue to cause tension on how better to distribute the burden amongst the members. For now, the yellow buses go on and remain a symbol of the political division present in Europe, as well as the human experiences of migrants trying to find a better life even in a war-torn continent. Those who manage to get to Brussels on Hungary's yellow buses still have a very long way ahead of them, but they are going to encounter the complexities of the EU's asylum regime. Even if they will be granted refugee status, the process of assimilation into European society takes a considerable time. A broken asylum system. First, we need to understand the crux of Hungary's criticism. The EU's common asylum system, particularly the Dublin Regulation, essentially mandates that the first country an asylum seeker enters within the EU is responsible for processing their claim. On the surface, this sounds like a reasonable approach. However, for countries like Hungary, which are located on the external borders of the EU, this policy places an enormous burden on their resources and infrastructure. Hungary, alongside other border nations such as Greece and Italy, has long argued that this system unfairly shifts the responsibility for handling the bulk of asylum seekers onto them, leaving wealthier countries like Germany, France, and those in Northern Europe relatively untouched. The numbers back up Hungary's argument. According to Eurostat, Hungary received over 29,000 asylum applications in 2015 during the height of the migrant crisis. While that number has significantly decreased since then, with only around 500 applications in 2022, the underlying issue remains. Hungary feels abandoned by the EU. Hungary's stance on migration.
So after this, there is no any chance to have any kind of compromise and agreement on migration.
From Hungary's perspective, the policies of the EU are both incorrect and defective. The EU's tactic for sharing asylum seekers has met with resistance. Hungary joined Poland and others in Central European countries in absolutely turning down quotas for the redistribution of migrants, despite ongoing legal disputes and the looming financial consequences from Brussels. Now, onto the buses. People must understand that the act of Hungary dispatching buses packed with migrants to Brussels goes far past logistics. It's an intentional political strategy designed to express Hungary's grievances with the EU's asylum framework. According to Orbán and those who backed him, Brussels has been too inactive in reshaping a dysfunctional system. Hungary sees itself under heavy strain from a migration crisis that ought to concern the EU as a whole. By dispatching these buses, Hungary effectively tells others, if you aren't going to help us, then we'll bring the problem to you. The goal of this move is to force EU leaders, notably Ursula von der Leyen, to confront the real challenges linked to migration. Hungary's message is clear. Brussels has run out of time to ignore the problems faced by countries that are at the forefront of Europe. Critics of the move argue that it's little more than a publicity stunt, designed to stoke nationalist sentiment at home and shift blame onto the EU. And while there's undoubtedly a political element to Hungary's actions, it also reflects the deep frustrations many EU member states feel about the common asylum system's failings. Brussels Mayor Philippe Klaus has firmly censured Hungary's plan to bus illegal migrants from the Hungarian-Serbian border directly to the Belgian capital.
C'est pas comme ça qu'on construit l'Union. Ce qui m'inquiète, c'est qu'ils président l'Union. Et je pense qu'ils n'en ont pas les capacités. Il est peut-être temps de réfléchir à savoir si la Hongrie...
A provocative move that has escalated tensions between Budapest and Brussels. In an interview with Euronews, Klaus made it clear that Belgium stands ready to block the buses, describing the plan as a provocation by Hungary's government under Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. I've spoken to the Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo, Klaus said. We will block these buses if they ever do depart. This is not something we will allow to happen on Belgian soil. Gergely Gulyás, a minister in Orbán's government, recently clarified the details of Hungary's bus plan, stating that it was not an operation targeting illegal migrants, as initially suggested. Instead, Gulyás claimed that the Hungarian government would only offer a free, one-way trip to Brussels to those who had already received political asylum in Hungary. This was in stark contrast to earlier reports from Hungarian officials who had implied that buses would be filled with illegal migrants seeking asylum. This shift in rhetoric adds to the confusion surrounding Hungary's plan. If the buses are intended for individuals who have already been granted asylum, then the provocation is less about burden shifting and more of a symbolic act aimed at embarrassing Brussels. Still, even in this scenario, the logistics of transporting asylum seekers across multiple European borders without proper coordination remain problematic. EU-Hungary relationship. The bus stunt represents a major progression in an already tense and complicated relationship between Hungary and the European Union. Over the last several years, Hungary has progressively adopted a rebellious posture, raising itself as a frequent foe to European Union regulations and policies, particularly surrounding migration. Currently observed events represent just the last phase of a drawn-out contest between Budapest and Brussels. Again and again, Hungary has been in disagreement with the European Commission over a range of topics, including problems related to judicial independence, media freedom, and observance of the rule of law. In reality, things were so overheated in 2018 that the European Parliament set off Article 7 procedures concerning Hungary. Over the years, Hungary has become increasingly defiant, positioning itself as a constant challenger to the EU's rules and policies, especially when it comes to migration. What we're seeing now is just the latest move in a long-standing tug-of-war between Budapest and Brussels. Hungary has repeatedly found itself at odds with the European Commission on a variety of issues, including concerns about judicial independence, media freedom, and adherence to the rule of law. Back in 2018, things got so heated that the European Parliament triggered Article 7 proceedings against Hungary. Such a step could, theoretically, lead Hungary to forfeit its voting status in the EU. Still, this hasn't actually come to fruition since the approval process needs consensus from all member states, and Hungary has found important supporters, particularly Poland, which has repeatedly supported Hungary on divisive issues. Still, of all the subjects of contention between Hungary and the EU, migration stands out as the biggest point of division. Hungary views itself as a defender of Europe's external borders, convinced that its hard line on migration is imperative to protect Hungary along with the whole of the European Union. According to Hungary, it's doing the challenging work of safeguarding the EU, which they argue Brussels does not fully grasp the difficulties that border countries face. Conversely, the EU is holding that Hungary is reducing the values of collective responsibility and solidarity that the Union stands for. According to Belgium's Secretary of State for Migration, Nicole de Moor, she reiterated the same concerns that Mayor Kloos brought up. She pledged that if Hungarian buses arrived in Brussels, she would send them back immediately. De Moor stressed that this isn't the way politics should be handled, making it clear that Belgium would not allow itself to be dragged into Prime Minister Orbán's political games. The situation is even more complicated because of how the Hungarian government is presenting the bus plan. For Hungary, this isn't just about transporting migrants to Brussels, it's a symbolic move. Hungary believes this action shows the EU's failure to fairly manage the migration crisis. By sending these buses, Hungary wants to force the EU to deal with what they think is a broken system. Hungarian leaders have made it clear that they're unhappy with current EU migration policies, and this bus plan is meant to make their complaints impossible to ignore. Hungary's government argues that countries like theirs, located on the EU's borders, are being unfairly burdened. They claim that other EU countries, especially those far from the borders, don't experience the same pressure from migration and aren't doing enough to help. This frustration has been a key part of Hungary's message, and the buses are the latest way to draw attention to what they see as a lack of support from the rest of the EU. Though Hungary's actions have faced a lot of criticism, the bigger problem of how to fairly handle migration in the EU remains unsolved. Hungary feels it's standing up for itself and other border countries that bear most of the responsibility for dealing with migrants. However, this strong and rebellious approach is only making the divide between Hungary and the rest of the EU worse, with no clear solution in sight. While the bus project aims to send a message, it also shows the long-standing problems the EU faces when it comes to managing migration fairly. Questions about responsibility, solidarity, and the EU's impact on its member states are likely to continue for some time. The Migration Challenge. To understand Hungary's concerns, we need to look at some key numbers. In 2015, around 1 million migrants and asylum seekers entered the EU, many of them fleeing war and violence in places like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. This migrant crisis led to a huge number of people arriving in Europe, and countries like Hungary felt overwhelmed. Northern European countries quickly became popular destinations for migrants, while Hungary turned into a transit country. In response, the Hungarian government built a 4-meter-high razor-wire fence along its borders with Serbia and Croatia. This decision faced criticism from human rights groups, but had strong support from many Hungarians. The border fence drastically reduced the number of people entering Hungary. In 2016, asylum requests dropped to about 30,000, and by 2021, there were fewer than 1,000. Despite these lower numbers, Hungary and the EU continue to clash, with Prime Minister Orbán arguing that EU policies encourage illegal immigration and put too much pressure on border countries like Hungary. Critics, however, point out that Hungary now has some of the lowest asylum application numbers in Europe. They argue that Orbán's government is exaggerating the problem for political reasons. Yet, the buses heading to Brussels show that Hungary remains deeply unhappy with how the EU is handling the situation. Ursula von der Leyen's response. As of now, Ursula von der Leyen has not publicly responded to Hungary's latest move. However, it's clear that the European Commission is not on the same page as Hungary when it comes to migration. Von der Leyen has repeatedly emphasized the need for a collective European approach to migration, one that balances the need for solidarity with the rights of member states to control their borders. In 2020, the European Commission unveiled the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, a comprehensive reform package aimed at addressing some of the issues raised by Hungary and other member states. The plan includes measures to strengthen Europe's external borders, improve the processing of asylum claims, and promote cooperation with non-EU countries to prevent irregular migration. However, Hungary remains skeptical of these reforms, arguing that they do not go far enough in addressing the root causes of migration or in protecting Europe's borders. Orbán relentlessly supports a more rigid method, calling for the initiative of hotspot centers located outside the EU to handle the evaluation of asylum claims prior to entry into European soil. The actions of Hungary have provoked important debates about the forthcoming EU migration policy. Is it possible for the EU to harmonize the differing interests among its member states about asylum and migration? Might the divide between states like Hungary and Brussels keep expanding? The bus plan is being cast as a solution to perceived double standards within the European Union by Hungary. Hungary's State Secretary Vari has leveled criticism at the EU for hypocrisy, asserting that while Hungary faces monetary penalties for its firm border controls, countries including Germany have set up temporary border measures to control irregular migration flows free of similar repercussions. The insights from Vari disclose the enormous arguments existing between Hungary and the EU over migration management. For a long time now, Hungary has defended its stance as essential for Europe's external security, while the EU capital feels that Hungarian methods undermine shared values within the EU, such as solidarity and common obligation. One thing is clear: the present system is failing to serve the needs of some. For many years now, there has been significant criticism of the Dublin regulation for putting an unfair weight on border nations, and reform initiatives have received harsh resistance. The buses from Hungary to Brussels might not seem particularly significant, but they do point to the immediate need for a new method regarding migration in Europe. There are no indications that the standoff between Hungary and the EU will let up at this time. As migration continues to be a divisive issue in European politics, the question remains: how is the EU going to advance, and will Hungary be kept on the outskirts or see its worries ultimately recognized? Philippe Claus expressed frustration that Hungary, as the current leader of the EU Council, should be working towards agreement instead of causing more political tension. His comments show how the EU is growing tired of Hungary's increasingly confrontational behavior. Although no buses have left Hungary yet, the ongoing argument between Brussels and Budapest is not likely to calm down soon. Hungary seems determined to challenge EU migration policies, while the European Commission and countries like Belgium are getting ready to block any attempts by Hungary to send migrants to Brussels. At the same time, the European Commission is keeping a close eye on the situation and is prepared to take action if Hungary goes through with its plan. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.